I'm delighted to be here in St. Louis to talk about the current situation of our world and our nation. I mentioned that we have 7 billion brothers and sisters on our planet. We need to figure out how do we get a government for this next century that works to address the problems that we face. How do we handle global warming? How do we handle the energy crisis? How do we handle the resource depletion? The Earth's been around for 5 billion years, and yet in the last 100 years, 95% of everything created by human hands has been created just in the last 100 years. There's an exponential growth of population, and there's a consumption of goods and services. When I served in Congress, after election, Democrats and Republicans understood that it was important for them to represent the public good and not the special interest. Yeah, there were a couple bad guys back there. I got elected by accident when Richard Nixon fired Archibald Cox for asking for Watergate tapes. 1 year later, I was a member of the United States Congress, joining Paul Simon of Illinois and Paul Tsongas of Massachusetts and Chris Dodd from Connecticut and Henry Waxman from California and Max Baucus from Montana and 75 Democratic freshmen. We were reformers back then. We were kind of a liberal version of the Tea Party. The first thing we did in January of 1975, I was a congressman for only a couple days, we unseated 5 committee chairs who were committee chairs by seniority. Remember Wilbur Mills fell in the tidal basin? He lost his chairmanship of the Ways to Be Mean Committee. But we took out the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, the Agriculture Committee, the Banking Committee. We were a group of energized individuals, men and women, who thought that government ought to represent the people and that we ought not to select our leaders simply by seniority. And we did some reforms. We passed the first energy bill. We passed the first resource recovery legislation. We invented something called the Older Americans Act to give seniors an opportunity. And not one piece of legislation was put in place by Democrats alone. My best friends were Senator Schweiker from Pennsylvania, Senator Hines from Pennsylvania, Jake Javits from New York, Senator Brooks from Massachusetts. The middle, the political middle in those days had a center. And Jesse Helms was to the far right, and liberals were over here on my far left, but the middle was the middle. And nothing passed unless a group of moderate Republicans who were fiscally conservative but cared about the environment, fiscally conservative and cared about human rights and civil rights and people's rights, collaborated with moderate to progressive Democrats to pass legislation. That has all changed. And we have corroded our democracy. About a year and a half ago, we invited a young man by the name of Bill Moyers. Some of you may have heard of him. John, have you heard of Bill Moyers? Yeah. Bill accepted the opportunity to speak at the 40th anniversary of Common Cause. We introduced him at 9 o'clock at night when everybody goes home in Washington, D.C. No one left. 400 people in the hall listened carefully as Bill took the podium. And Bill gave an articulate speech. But here's the core message. Bill said, "This is the most dangerous moment in American history for democracy. We're either going to be a nation that's of and by and for the people, or of and by and for large corporations and the wealthy." Bill was railing against something called Citizens United. You know what that is. That's where the Supreme Court voted 5-4 to give corporations and labor unions the ability to use their corporate treasuries in political campaigning. You've seen the results of that. We watched the Republican primary recently. Newt Gingrich, who I've known since 1977, got $21 million from one individual, which he wasn't able to get before Citizens United. But he got that money to put into a political action committee, a super PAC, and he could then spend that money on his primary campaign. Romney set up a super PAC and got individuals to give money, and because of Citizens United, can give unlimited amounts of money to the super PAC. And the 5 who voted in the majority, I think, were pretty naive to think that they weren't buying access. And they were naive to say that there's no corruption with money in politics. Money is corroding our system. I even got cranky with President Obama. President Obama, in a State of the Union address, pointed out the Supreme Court, made them wiggle in their seats, made them squirm, and said that Citizens United should be pushed back. But then after all of these super PACs were created, even Obama set up a super PAC. Obama could raise $1 billion without putting a super PAC together. But here's what's going to happen this year. Obama's going to raise $1 billion. Romney's going to raise $1 billion. The super PACs are going to put $2 or $3 billion in, and you're going to get the best government money can buy. And here's one of the side issues that hasn't been in the media. Maybe, Don, you should have a program on this issue. The super PACs, mostly conservative, but some liberal, have a lot of money because of this unlimited money. They're buying up all of the television commercial time for September and October. All you're going to see are negative ads in September and October. And they're buying all of that airtime up with commercials because they have money to put down and buy them. And they're also buying up all the space on our websites, where on Google and Yahoo and all of those you can buy little taglines. They're buying that space up as well, so that a lot of the local candidates who might want to be on local radio and television, they might be able to find space at 2 o'clock in the morning. And the cost of those commercials will in fact be jacked up because there's so few of them left. Common Cause is going to think about figuring out a way to get that aired over the next little bit. But let me say a word about Common Cause. When I became head of Common Cause had fallen asleep about 1995. When we came into some fiscal challenge, we did away with our magazine, which came out 10 times a year. We had a couple 100,000 members. We coasted on our direct mail. We had some good presidents, and we did a lot of good things in the States, but we hadn't balanced our budget in 10 years when I took over as head of Common Cause. I learned a lesson having salvaged 2 organizations that were fiscally bankrupt, and discovered that you can't focus on the debt and deficit, you got to focus on vision and mission. So what you see with Common Cause today is that we're trying to be the uncommon cause. And we started by listening to Bill Moyers, who scared the heck out of us. And then we put Robert Reich, the former Labor Secretary, as chair of our board, and he's the first chair of my board with a sense of humor and a sense of hope. Good guy. And then the 2010 election occurred, and many of you might have been depressed after the 2010 election. We decided rather than to be depressed, we'd become uncommon. And the first thing we did was take on the Koch brothers. You know David and Charles Koch. They have a combined resource of $44 billion. They're libertarians. It's okay to be libertarian. It's okay to have their philosophy, except they're trying to buy access. Under Citizens United, they now can put more money into more organizations and buy more access. They had 12 members of the House Energy and Science Committee that they supported sign a pledge that they would support no regulation of clean air or clean water, because their corporations thrive on dirtying the air and dirtying the corporation. We caught them in University of Miami State, no, Florida State, where they put money in to set up an institute at Florida State and had a general person's agreement with the president, a letter of understanding, that if the professors didn't support their ideological positions, they would take their money back. I was president of graduate school, and with academic freedom, That would be unheard of to put that kind of restriction on money. But these guys, twice a year for 10 years, had these secret meetings, bringing Glenn Beck and other conservative legislators and conservative journalists to these meetings to corporatize it, to use the term that Bill Moyers helped me to understand called a plutocracy. They wanted to move the nation towards a plutocracy. So we found out that they were meeting in Rancho Mirage, California, and this uncommon common cause, rather than being genetically nice, we decided to show up at their meeting in late January, a year and a half ago. But along the way, we discovered that Clarence Thomas and Justice Scalia had been keynote speakers at their events. Scalia in 07, Thomas in 08, and in 09, the Supreme Court did an extraordinary thing. In June of 09, when the Supreme Court normally comes to the conclusion of all of their cases, they took this little bitty case called Citizens United versus the FEC. This Citizens United had done a movie trashing Hillary Clinton. The FEC said you had to disclose your donors. Citizens United said, no, we don't want to disclose our donors. The Supreme Court could have decided on that narrow case. The Supreme Court took it off the docket in June of 09, held it over, and the Supreme Court doesn't go into session until October. In September, they had a very extraordinary session. And in January, when they came out with their decision, 5-4, they did away with laws regulating finances in elections going back to Teddy Roosevelt and the Tillman Act in 1907. Now, I have to give the Supreme Court a little bit of credit. The Supreme Court said, while we vote 5-4 on the whole bill, 8 of the 9 justices said that the House and the Senate should pass disclosed legislation. They should pass legislation to prevent foreign corporations from using their corporate treasuries in political campaigns. And our corporations, when they put money into the campaigns, should in fact disclose who is putting the money in, and that those corporations should be named. So, yay for the 8 justices. The House passed a disclosed bill based on what the Supreme Court justices wanted. The President Obama, he wanted disclosed legislation. So it passed the House, the President wanted it, went to the Senate. It got 59 votes in the Senate. And it failed because of the filibuster. This is not the subject of tonight's talk, but if you want some fun, email me, r.edgar@commoncause.org, and ask for a lawsuit which we just filed in the federal courts. We believe the filibuster is unconstitutional. We believe the Founding Fathers were smart enough. The Founding Fathers put 6 instances in the Constitution for a supermajority. You can't impeach a president without a supermajority vote. You can't have a trade issue without a supermajority vote. You can't amend the Constitution without a supermajority vote. If you read the Federalist Papers, English common law, nowhere, no other nation, no other democracy, nowhere has democracy ever been based on supermajority voting. And it's interesting, the filibuster is not in the Constitution. It was invented by Aaron Burr 20 years after the Constitution. It wasn't named a filibuster until 50 years after the Constitution, and up until 1970, it had been used more often to protect slavery and lynching laws than human rights or civil rights or people's rights. And it does, the filibuster takes the only job away from the vice president that's in the Constitution, which is to break ties. So we had a board member convince the whole board of Common Cause that the filibuster is not only unconstitutional, but you know what would have happened if the filibuster didn't exist? Disclosed legislation would have passed. The DREAM Act, which got 55 votes, and passed the House and was supported by it would have passed. Healthcare wouldn't be before the Supreme Court. Healthcare had been watered down because of the filibuster and the public option that would have been in the healthcare legislation was blocked because of the filibuster, and a whole bunch